The Bible. In its pages are the words of Moses, Isaiah, Paul, and others, long ago saints who took part in the story God was writing in their day and is still writing in ours. But the Bible is more than the words of departed saints. It's the Word of God. Through the Bible, the Creator of the universe speaks to us. The Bible is powerful. How could it not be? Welcome to Bible Connection, the podcast where we talk about the Bible and how it connects to every facet of life imaginable.
Today we're at Dallas Theological Seminary talking with Dr. Daniel B. Wallace and Dr. W. Hall Harris. They have devoted their lives to the accuracy of Scripture and making it understandable. Hall and Dan have both been part of the translation team for the NET Bible. Join us as we discuss how they came to their decision to create an entirely new translation. I'm your host, Nikki Getman. You're listening to Bible Connection. There's a story that you guys have that I want to delve into. And this happened about 25 years ago. You were at a conference in Philadelphia, and you had a significant conversation at that conference that created a big project. Can you tell us about what that was?
This may be like a marriage in the sense that, you know, it's when you share what happened when you met your wife, and we'll have contradictions in terms of the story. So I'd rather have you go first so I can correct you rather than the other way around.
Right.
Okay.
That's typical, isn't it? No.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry. Well, actually, we were both attending ETS and SBL/AAR in Philadelphia in the fall of 1995. And from my perspective, I happened to run into a couple of people who worked with a website online called Bible.org. And they said, you want to come and join us for dinner tonight? We're going to go to a restaurant. And I said, sure. And little did I know this was going to turn into a lengthy discussion on how to solve a problem that this biblical studies website had, which was that they were producing, and had been for a year or so, online Bible study materials, sermons, donated material from various pastors, teachers, and Dallas Seminary professors. And that material posted online quoted a lot of Bible verses, as you might expect, but it was turning into a bit of a rights problem because there were so many Bible verses that it was exceeding the free use copyright issues. And so what do we do? Do we stop posting material, or do we try to do something about a translation? And so there were, about a dozen people at this dinner, give or take.
Well, I remember the dinner with just you and me and Joe in the little Italian restaurant. Maybe that was
No, I
afterwards.
remember other people being present.
Were there others, Joe?
Yeah.
Seven.
Seven.
Okay. I had 3, you had
see?
12, he had 7. He must be right.
In any event, the talk turned to what would it take to do a translation that could be posted on the internet without restriction. And things started with, let's just take a public domain translation like the 1901 ASV, for example, and let's clean it up a bit and we can post it. And the only translation at this point that you could find online back in 95, if you could find any at all, would be the King James Version. So Dan and I started kind of a side conversation about what would it take. And I think you started taking some notes on the back of an envelope. I think it must have been an envelope because this restaurant was way too nice to have paper napkins.
I may have used a cloth napkin.
No, I don't.
Well, I'll start
maybe
looking.
You did.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll start looking for envelopes. I've been looking for a napkin, and I've got it at home someplace.
It was a white business envelope,
Good
I
grief.
think, on
What
the
a
back.
memory.
Yeah, well, I have pictures in my head. Yeah, and so you were jotting down, what it would take in terms of hours and people and things like that in the conversation.
And even individual translators.
Yes, because we
wrote
started
those down.
thinking of people that we could use who actually had done a lot of work in particular books, which was one of the unique things about the way this translation committee kind of got formed. Rather than have a general committee where everybody works on everything and you end up with a result where the whole Bible sounds like it was written by an editor flat across the board. There are different styles involved, there are different voices, but these people were top people who had spent, in some cases, virtually their whole professional career teaching on one or two of these books. At least they specialized in them. And so we went back to the hotel, and it was getting really late. I remember it being around midnight or something.
Yeah, it was late.
And we actually got some people out of bed and got them to come down to the lobby and get them involved in this conversation. I remember specifically 3 or 4 people, and there were some people that were still down in the lobby, and we kind of corralled them and said, come over, and we just sat around and had a big kind of impromptu committee meeting.
And we talked for a long time.
Planning session that
It's very exciting.
kind of was the kickoff and start for the Internet Study Bible. That's what's on the contracts that were originally written, because we didn't have the name Net Bible at that time. That came later. My wife Ursula actually came up with Net as, notes, explanation, translation, and Net for Internet, and Bible for Bible.
And New English translation.
And
So
then
it's
it
a
became New English
quadruple
translation.
entendre. Is that what it is?
Yeah, something
I thought
like
it was
that.
a triple. I didn't know about the other
So
things.
anyway, that's a long story. But anyway, you want to take over from
You've said
there?
everything I wanted to say, except you've corrected everything that I was going to say wrong. So,
Well, you want to give your version?
no, it's much shorter than yours.
Well, so I can move this forward.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think just the fact that we got excited about this. I thought we were going to use the ASV for a while, and that just dissolved in a few weeks.
I think it started, but I think it was pretty. I still have in the back of my head, we were still at SBL when the idea came up of why don't we just do a whole new one?
Yeah, I know.
But
I know.
anyway.
Joe had wanted us to record our insights and comments on the translation and exegesis and interpretation because he felt that we're doing this in the Bible.org notes or the blogs or whatever you call them back then, but we weren't doing it in relationship to a specific translation. And at times we would be saying, this is how we would translate this, and then you look at translations that are out there and they're so different from what we were saying in some places. We had to justify the decisions we were making and interact with them. And I think that was part of what this developed into, is that Joe wanted it to be explaining why you're doing what you're doing with the translation.
Exactly. And it really gave us the opportunity to let the translators be transparent and reflect what was going through their minds at the time they were coming up with the translation. And that included many times various options for different ways to translate. And later we even added in some examples from other translations to illustrate this. But the notes were moving from the very beginning from simply a defense of what we chose to put in the translation to alternatives that other scholars had taken to show how you could translate it this way or that way or the other way. Even though we still have a preference, we're going to reflect the other views in the notes.
And that's something that's really unique about this translation is that you decided early on to keep track of all of that, what was going on with the translators' decision-making, and then looking at what the other translators who have worked on other Bible translations
It's unique in
have done.
terms of us keeping track of it, keeping records of it, but also in publishing it so that the Net Bible has become a resource that translators for other translations have said, we couldn't do our work without this as a steady companion.
Right. And then the other thing that you did that was unique to this translation and this translation process was you decided to put the translation, the early drafts of the translation, out on the internet. And that had never been done before either. It's really one of those things that's unique to this time and place in culture and technology, that you were able to publish the notes because you were free of printing constraints, etc., but also that you could beta test this really worldwide. Can you tell us about how you did that and what the outcome was?
I'll start, then you can finish.
Fair enough.
The beta testing, I think, has been one of the things that's really set the Net Bible apart, because we were being open with outsiders to see the decisions we're making and getting criticisms and comments and praise and things like this. And I believe we got about 1 million comments. Is that?
I think so, yes.
From outsiders. Now, one of the things that makes this different is that all other translations have submitted the final publication, and that's when the public gets to see it. Ours was in the process of us doing it. We wouldn't call it a rough draft, it would be more than that, but we wanted to get some input from others. And we got input from, sometimes it would be a linguist, like a field translator. Other times it would be somebody whose second language was English. And they made every bit as useful comments as biblical scholars would, because the issue you're facing is not just what does the Bible say, but how can we say that in our own language that honestly and faithfully reflects the original text, both in terms of denotation and connotation, if possible. So I think doing the beta test was a huge coup for the Net Bible that could only have been done in this era. And yet other translations, I don't think, have followed suit. They do something a little different still.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think, again, the transparency this promotes, because I won't say that I looked at every one of those million comments, but I sure looked at a lot of them, and other people looked at other ones. And it's very interesting that sometimes people will see things from their perspective that professional scholars won't see. And you realize, oh, I really have a problem here, and do I really want to say it that way? And so I'll never forget the night I got a late night call from Joe, our sponsor, saying it was something along the lines of, so you have Jesus connected with the woman caught in adultery, or Jesus and a woman are caught in adultery. And I said, what? Wait, whoa. And of course, it was a section in John chapter 7:53 to 8:11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. And it was the paragraph title. And I was reading it, I had put in Jesus and a woman caught in adultery. And that's how I was reading it. It's about Jesus and it's about a woman caught in adultery. But if you read that same thing as a newspaper headline, Jesus and a woman caught in adultery, it has a very different take to it. That got changed very quickly. We dropped Jesus, now it's just a woman caught in adultery.
It's not that
Jesus
we really want to drop
in it.
Jesus, but in this context,
That's
we
right.
do.
He's just not in the paragraph title any longer. He's still in the story.
Right.
But that's a case of something that was totally, I was blindsided by that. It was really funny. I did several double takes.
I'd like to mention another thing that's been extremely beneficial in the beta test processing, and that is scholars who had recently published an article or were in the process of doing so, or a book, or getting their dissertations done. They would contact us and say, here's another way you could look at this passage. And I remember, for example, what we did with, I think it's Romans 3:25, about whom God publicly displayed as a mercy seat. And the Greek word hilasterion has typically been translated as a means of propitiation. And I think the NIV has a means of atoning for sin, something like that. But this dissertation, this student had been working for 12 years at Cambridge University. He sent us his comment, and we said, well, send us the dissertation so we can read it and sift through it. And Mike Buer, our assistant for the New Testament editors, I passed it on to him. I said, Mike, read this thing and give us a summary of it. Let's see what we should do. So sometimes we'd get absolutely the most current material out there that nobody else knew about and would not for years because of the pipeline and getting something published. This was very exciting to have this every bit as current as it could possibly be.
Yeah. And what about challenging bias? Because one of the things I know you are very aware of as scholars is that process and that challenge of kind of intrinsic bias. How does that affected the way the translation was rendered and or the notes that accompany the translation? How did that beta test process, or even it's still open for comment, right? How has that worked?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to say everybody who translates, everybody who does exegetical work, everybody who writes commentaries has some kind of inherent bias, and it's very difficult to get around it. One of the best ways to get around it is to do it in community and to have feedback from other people. Whether it's, and there are different ways to achieve that. Some translations have been produced with a very large translation team, like over 100 scholars, which to our thinking is a bit unwieldy. We went with a much smaller team of about 25. But the feedback was coming from the people who were viewing it online and sending us comments and helping us see that maybe there's things we're implying that we don't intend to imply. And so, again, the beta testing process online that went on for quite a while, it was actually, we went through a first beta, then first beta of the New Testament, then the complete Bible, and then a second beta, and finally came out with the first release edition in about 2005, 2006. So the thing had been underway for 10 years before we actually released what we called a first edition. But of course, there's still more work to do, so we're still moving forward. And the English language is still continuing to change and evolve as well.
And this is the external controls, but we also had internal controls. That you have an initial translator, and we only chose the translators that we really knew that particular book very, very well from having taught it from the original language for many, many years. And then we'd have the editorial committee of typically 3 people for Old Testament or for New that is working through these things. Now, if it came down to all 3 of us disagree with what the translator has got, then that's what we would go with. If it was a split, then we'd have to wrestle with those things. But the translator is providing the initial translation with notes. And there would be times when we'd write back to them or talk to them and say, hey, we need to get more justification on this. Other times we simply said, this is as much justification as can be done. We need to wrestle with this further. So in other words, there was internal control of not just the translator, but submitting that work to an editorial board or committee. Plus, once we post that beta version, then outsiders are looking at it from all sorts of perspectives. So Hall's exactly right. You can never get rid of bias. It's always going to be there.
Right.
But one of the most important things that we have taught our students as professors is you need to be your harshest critic. And you need to challenge your own biases as much as you possibly can.
One of the things we did, interestingly, was we took our draft translation of the text and notes for the book of Revelation, and we sent them to a scholar who held a very different view than we did on the book of Revelation, and asked him to review the translation and notes and see if he felt we were being too biased in terms of our own perspective. And his reply came back and said, well, it's actually very good. And he suggested a few changes in some connective words or conjunctions, like so or and. He felt that we're giving maybe more of a slightly time sequence or temporal sequence to the text than was justified. And so we went back and revised some of those based on his input, which we found very helpful.
And a lot of those perspectives that came in or that you worked through, whether or not that was reflected in the translation, those decisions were reflected in the notes, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Magnificent notes. It gives us an opportunity that no other translation is able to do because, I'm sorry, I've interrupted you again.
Oh, that's fine.
But just to have those notes means we don't have to make a decision between this rendering and this rendering. We can actually have both. And typically the notes are going to be Greek says this or the Hebrew or Aramaic says this. And the translation is going to be a little bit more nuanced, perhaps a little bit more literary quality, but it's a quality of reading that we wanted to hit in the translation that was still faithful to the meaning of the original. And the notes would often say, we have rendered it this way, but the Greek actually says this. And if it was justifiable, we would say, here's why we've rendered it this way. Other times you could just see, well, this is what the Greek says, and there's not a difference in meaning, but it's just a different rendering.
It's really interesting, too, when you go through the notes, you can see other translations. You'll cite how other translations made their decisions. Not all the time or in every text or in every verse or section, but you'll see some of that. And it's easy for someone to take whatever their translation is and compare it to your notes and see why their translators in that translation made those decisions. It's a really spectacular feature, I think, of the notes.
I agree. One of the things we did early on with the Net Bible is we would show it to people and say, find your favorite verse and read both the translation and the notes. And invariably, there's going to be a note on those famous passages. And they go, oh, I never realized it could be translated this. I never understood that this is what it meant. It was the best seller for the Net Bible.
Right.
No other translation has notes like this.
Right.
Yeah, I think another factor that works alongside this is when we talk about the nature of the translation itself, whether it's extremely literal, which used to be called formal equivalence, where it's very, very wooden and close to the original language but doesn't sound like natural English, or whether it's a more dynamic translation, that is, it moves more in the direction of a very smooth reading paraphrase. Using these notes, we were able to sort of have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, because the very formal renderings usually end up in the notes, often tagged as Greek or Hebrew, where it's very literal, but that allows us in the translation itself to use a somewhat freer, smoother, better sounding and reading English translation.
Well, it's really interesting since I work for a publisher who publishes, tends to publish very traditional texts, and all the way back to the King James. We do a lot of publishing in the King James. And of course, the New King James, which also has its set of translator notes, which is an interesting thing, to then be all the way up here to the NET and in the notes see all that context for how Bibles have been translated into English before the King James, really, because Tyndale was so important to developing the King James. And it's a really interesting project to be part of at Nelson and seeing that long history. And I think it's interesting that there are times where you've said or found that the King James did it right, and maybe more modern translations have gone a different way. And there's one in 1 Peter that you and I were talking about a few weeks ago that has really shifted my thoughts about that rendering, and it goes back to the King James, like the way you.
Yeah, it's. I think it's 1 Peter 5, 7, and 8, where the King James speaks about casting our cares on Him because He cares for us or careth for us. Most translators also feel that participle is called an imperatival participle, and you do have a large cluster of such things in 1 Peter, but they congregate in chapters 2 and 3. And if you can have a participle, an ing word, that you can relate back to a finite verb, that's almost always the best way to treat it in Greek. I think part of the reason that the King James translators got it right is because in 17th century English, there were longer sentences. Today we speak in much shorter sentences, and so we just have to take a pause and put a period there and keep going. I'll give an illustration, at least from Greek, not in the King James, but the longest sentence we have in the Greek New Testament is Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. I think it's something like 225 words. One long sentence. One German scholar called it Ein Monstrosität. Of course, I don't need to translate that. It's not the best Greek. Wonderful theology, but the Greek is a little odd. But we still have to try to reflect on these things and wrestle with what is the author trying to get at. And I thought that was a very important point with the casting, that is the definition of how one humbles oneself.
And God will exalt you in due time if you humble yourselves under his mighty hand by casting all your cares on him, because he cares for you. If you were advising pastors why the NET was such an important tool for them to have, either for themselves or their congregations, what would you say?
I would say because it gives you an unparalleled window back into the world of the text as it was originally written and originally understood by the earliest audiences. It gives you cultural background, it gives you grammatical and syntactical input, it gives you options for how this could be rendered more than one way or understood more than one way. And yet, in the final analysis, it gives you a really solid basis for being able to explain the text based on how it would have been understood by its earliest readers. One example I always like to go back to, because almost everybody has heard this at some point or other, is the story of the camel and the needle's eye. It's in Matthew 19:24 in parallels. And as everybody knows, Jesus says to the rich young ruler, it's easier for, well, actually, he says it to the disciples after the rich young ruler has taken off, rather disappointed. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And most people, including many who've gone on visits to the Holy Land and toured Jerusalem, their tour guide has shown them this really narrow gate in the city wall, in the old city wall in Jerusalem, with the explanation that this is called the needle's eye, and the camel could only fit through here by stooping down and by having all the baggage unloaded off the camel's back, and then the camel could squeeze through. Okay, great. There's just that there's some problems with that explanation.
But it's such a wonderful
It's such a
illustration. We
wonderful
want it to be true.
story. That's exactly right. It is. But I have a friend who is a certified Israeli tour guide, and I asked him about this. And he said, I said, how do you handle this? And he says, well, we take people and we show them this and we tell them the real story. The problem is that gate, the one that's currently identified as the needle's eye, dates from sometime in the Middle Ages. It was not there in Jesus' day.
Right.
And so Jesus could not have been using it as an illustration to his disciples. They wouldn't have had any idea what he was talking about. A needle in Jesus' day was a sewing needle. And we actually have illustrations of camels with a big sewing needle around their neck, you know, indicating in some of these illuminated manuscripts how the copyist actually understood this was to be taken. But the point is that our notes point that out, and our notes prevent the pastor who preaches on that passage from perpetuating not just a kind of a funny tale that seems fairly innocuous, but when you get down and think about it, it's theologically very problematic, because what you're saying is with the camel, you can squeeze through the gate if you just unburden yourself from all your baggage you're carrying. So the person who wants to get into the kingdom of heaven, if they just unburden themselves from all their riches, you know, and give it away and all, then they'll be good enough to get into heaven. Last time I checked, that's pretty seriously involving human works in salvation. That if you only do enough charitable works and make enough donations, God will accept you into heaven. You can just squeeze through. But Jesus replied to the disciples after this, when the disciples pick up on this, their response to Jesus is, then who can be saved? And Jesus' reply is, well, with humans it's impossible, but with God all things are possible, implying that salvation's purely a work of God. There's no human effort involved in it whatsoever. So no matter how much of your baggage you manage to unburden yourself of, it's not going to be enough to get you in. And that's the kind of thing from a cultural, historical background that the Net Bible Notes bring to the attention of the reader that many readers are not aware of. I've heard a lot of sermons on gates in Jerusalem
some
and camels.
Schools and things. I would add that what pastors have when they're trying to prepare a sermon is they may have several commentaries, they have their Greek or their Hebrew texts, their lexicons, grammars, all sorts of things. And this puts at their fingertips the most salient of those tools for that given passage. And so it covers, there may be 100 pages, 200 pages of material they would have needed to sift through, and this makes it right at their fingertips so they can see what are the most important issues to wrestle with. But on top of that, what it does is it requires, I think, of pastors to do their homework, because you've got lay people that are bringing these Net Bibles to church, and they're reading the notes and they're saying, wait a minute, our pastor said this, didn't he realize that the Aramaic can't mean that? You know, those kinds of things. And so obviously we want to be respectful of pastors, but we also want pastors to be in the text. And the Net Bible has already shown itself to be something that gets pastors to be doing their homework a little bit more. It's the Word of God. We need to be doing
And
this.
the people in the pews,
Yes.
whether they know the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic or not, you've opened that world to people who aren't as familiar with those texts as
Exactly
scholars are.
right. One of our original goals from the very beginning was to increase the level of biblical literacy, not just of pastors, but of lay people in congregations, everybody, seminary students, Bible college students, university students, across the board, that people would find the world of the Bible and all it entails more accessible through what we do. I have a friend who's a retired Presbyterian minister, and because he's part-time pastoral staff at a church, he received from me one of the early editions of the Net Bible Full Notes. And after he had examined it for a while, his reply to me was, this thing is a seminary in a box. And
Great
what
line.
he meant by that, he had an MDiv degree where he was not required to study the biblical languages. Great pastoral care, lovely person, wonderful heart for ministry, but now he has access to biblical languages in ways he hadn't dreamed. And here he's retired and he's wishing he'd had this years ago. That's what it can do.
That's a great line. Very, very helpful to think of it along those lines, both for pastors and lay people to see, okay, this is what goes into making a Bible translation. I think it's important for Christians today to recognize how serious we should take the Bible, because in recent decades, Scripture has become marginalized within the church. And I'll preach on whatever, but the Bible is just kind of, I may read the passage, but I don't really need to get into the details. And I would love to see the Net Bible be used of God to bring people back to the Scriptures so that they can magnify Jesus Christ, the real Jesus Christ, the one of the Bible.
That's a great way to end. Thank you, Dan. Dr. Wallace, Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining us today. We are just thrilled to be able to be your publishing partner with the NET and look forward to many years of service to the church with this translation.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you.
Thank you.